to look after the sound system last week, and that's we weren't able to have it. And we finished it, and I'd asked and given people an invitation if they had any book or any topic that they wanted to discuss to come and see me. And so tonight we're dealing with the book of Esther, and you can blame Carly. Because Carly said to me, "Can we do Esther?" And I thought, okay. So it's the book of Esther. We aim to please in whichever way we can. Tonight it is looking at, and I've tried to make it as interesting as possible. This is not working because the batteries are cactus with it. So you're going to have to do it up the front or at the back there. It's called Surviving the Age of Cancer Culture. And so, what is cancer culture? How do we define it? We're experiencing it. It's happening. Well, what is it?
If you don't like Ezzy, you make up another story.
Well, you change it. You change it. But really, what we have with cancer culture is a culture of bullying. It's based on power, and it's not based on truth. To cancel someone means to silence them. You do whatever is necessary to make sure their views are never heard, or they're demonised to the point that they cease to exist, or they no longer are considered to be a threat to the narrative that's being proposed. Now, cancer culture is based on an assumption of power, not truth as being the only way to bring about change. If you change the group in power, you can change the culture. You take away the freedom of people to speak against you by cancelling them out. The cancer culture thinking is built on the idea that power shapes all relationships. What I mean by that, if I have power over you, I can force you to do whatever I want. And you are in no position to negotiate or argue against me, because I don't have to listen to you, and I don't want to listen to you and your point of view, so I can bully you into submission. And the next slide actually says, think like us or be cancelled. Think like us or be cancelled. And those who get caught up in this process of cancer culture have no intention, and I repeat that, have no intention in engaging with others to find workable solutions to problems. It's about presenting one case that must be followed without argument or debate. There is no debate, there's no sharing of ideas. It resorts to character assassinating a person by presenting gossip, innuendos, or muckraking a person's past mistakes and putting it into the public arena to discredit and shame anyone who puts up any resistance to their way of thinking. And we're seeing that in our social media, the number of people who have been shamed by these people. The cancer culture, you can, the next slide. You can see by this little diagram, social media is the main means, but there's objectionable behaviour. If you see something that doesn't fit the values, then it's objectionable. And there's a collective consciousness that there are people who want to push an agenda. And so what happens is, if you would go against that agenda, you're ostracised. Then you're censored. Your reputation is damaged. You're shamed, and then you're banned. And we've all seen how that works in our modern day today. But that's, in essence, what cancer culture and its process looks like. So what is the result of cancer culture? Does it work? Does it work? Instead of optimism, there's cynicism. There's narcissism instead of selflessness. There's silence instead of discussion. We're in a battle over the fundamental reality, if you like, of what it means to be a human being. And I find it very interesting that politicians can't even describe what a woman is or a man is anymore. They just don't know what to say. But cancer culture defines and judges you by the group you belong to and by your latest mistake. This is a false story of reality and needs to be encountered with the true story. Most of the evidence suggests that cancer culture remains ineffective. It has its root in postmodernism, which says there are many ways to look at life and no one idea is better than another. What is right to you may not be right for another. But if I tell my narrative enough times in the public arena, then enough people will begin to believe it. And there'll be more people who believe it, and that gives me the power to bring about change because the majority of people accept that view as being legitimate, whether it's true or not. And that's what's happening in our society. Now you might say, well, how does this deal with the book of Esther? You would be surprised just how this crosses over into the Persian culture of the time. The next slide. The confirmation of authority in verses 1 and 2. From Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian tyrant and world conqueror, through the Artaxerxes of the Medes and Persians, many have assumed the motto, might is right. Might will bring about and break up any opposition, and these tyrants rule with power and authority over those they've conquered. The Jewish people here in the book of Esther are a religious minority in a dominant culture that lived a completely different lifestyle. They didn't have a worldview about how things were to function or what people could and couldn't do. The challenge was, how do they survive in this dominant culture which was intent on cancelling them out as a people? What options did they have? Did they withdraw? Did they assimilate? Did they protest? Did they offer criticism? They had no king. They had no army to fight for them. They had no land they could call their own. They are at the mercy of those who were in authority over them. And there are so many similarities in our day with this cancer culture movement. Our politically correct society are only concerned about their appearances and power. They offer no viable solutions. They offer virtue signalling to garner support, to appear as though they're doing something when they're not. They have no intentions of dealing with the issues because looking good is more important. Truth is sacrificed on the altar of convenience. The motto is, truth is what I say it is. It's my truth, and you have no right to disagree with me because this is the truth as I see it. And as we look at the book of Esther, I'm praying we are encouraged that God is always interested in truth and people standing on the truth. And he expects his people to stand on it no matter the pressure or opposition to change in order to adopt a current narrative. God is working behind the scenes to accomplish his purposes. And no matter how bad things appear to be, God has a solution and will triumph over the cancer culture mob. But he wants us to remain steadfast. He wants us to remain faithful and see God at work even in the most difficult of circumstances. In this opening chapter of Esther, it reveals to us the prevailing condition of the society in which God's people found themselves. It was pagan through and through. It promoted the god of self. It would never deny any appetites or pleasures that the people wanted to indulge themselves with. In other words, nothing was off limits. Anything goes was the mentality of the people. And this is where God's people found themselves. If you like, they were in survival mode, trying to preserve their godly lifestyle against overwhelming opposition. While paganism or cancer culture was dominated the thinking of many in the Persian Empire, God still protected and enabled his people to flourish despite this opposition. The next slide. Verse 1a says, this is what happened during the reign of King Xerxes. Now, who was Xerxes? If you read some translations, and it might be in yours, you'll have the word Ahasuerus, King Ahasuerus, or Artaxerxes in some. But who was he? Which one is it? And I've put this little next slide up. This shows you the different Persian kings, from Cyrus II, the Great, right through to Darius III. And you'll see in there, you've got Xerxes and the word Ahasuerus, the king who marries Esther. And you'll notice afterwards, Artaxerxes was his son. He commissions Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple. So what you have is Xerxes was the son of Darius the Great. Now, I don't know whether that confused you anymore, but Xerxes is not Artaxerxes. And to make that more interesting, Xerxes is in the book of Esther. He was cruel, he was a vicious person who used extreme measures to keep control of his subject. And the interesting thing that I found about the name Xerxes, we find that Ahasuerus was the Persian name given to him. Xerxes is the Babylonian name given to him. So that's why there's a connection between the two, but it's one and the same person. Ahasuerus was Xerxes. Now, he was a cruel and vicious person who used whatever methods to control. And I found some interesting accounts of the type of person he was. One account recorded for us in history exposes the extreme measures he used. When a storm stopped his progress for invading Greece through what is known as the Hellespont, today we know it as the Dardanelles, which was a narrow body of water only a mile across at certain points. But what this did was provide a formidable barrier between Asia and Europe. And Xerxes commissioned his engineers to build bridges to span that narrow gap. And one of the historians of that time says about these bridges, the engineers first threw parallel structures across the straits, one using flax cables, the other using papyrus cables connected to windlasses on the shore. But a storm shattered the bridges. And Xerxes' anger was directed not just at the engineers, who incidentally lost their heads, but also at the bridge Hellespont itself. The waters were whipped 300 times with shackles dropped in them as a mark of enslavement. So, really? You're whipping water? As it says there, it says 3,000 times or 300 times. You're whacking the water. Yeah, right, that's going to do something. But it shows the temperamental mindset of Xerxes. So what he did then was get a new batch of engineers. Now, they were very determined that they were not going to end up like their predecessors. So the bridges were rebuilt. This time, each was girded by a combination of flax and papyrus cables. Beaded along the two sets of cables were more than 600 side-by-side posts serving as pontoons. They in turn were anchored at both ends and spaced far enough apart to allow the ships to pass between them. Laid from one side to the tethered ships to the other side was a roadway, fenced and covered with grasses and earth, so the beasts of burdens would not look out to the sea below and panic. So it shows one aspect. Another account talks about how Xerxes and his large army were given hospitality on its march through Greece by a rich person called Lydian, who also offered to contribute an enormous sum towards the expenses of the war. Xerxes was infuriated by the request of this man. This man had 5 sons who were in Xerxes' army, and he asked that the oldest son be released so he could be a comfort to this man in his declining years. What did Xerxes do? Did he honour the request? Well, once again, we see the type of man he is. He commanded that his son be cut up into pieces, the parts placed so that the army passed between them. He would then later murder his own brother and his brother's wife in very unpleasant circumstances. So we see the type of man that Xerxes was. Not somebody you would look up to, want to be as an example, but he had authority. When he came to the throne, his first task was to complete the building of the palace in Susa, began by Darius, his father, and then to bring a rebellious Egypt back under his rule. The subjugation of Egypt was completed in the 2nd year of his reign, and so on achieving that, he turned his attention towards Greece because he wanted to further his father's ambitions and to wipe out what he took as a personal insult towards his father at the defeat of Marathon, and he wanted to expand his empire even further. So the opening chapter here in Esther speaks of the events which took place at this time, the 3rd year of his reign, and it refers to what took place just before the Greek expedition, a gathering together of the king's nobles and officers. Indeed, the gathering of the nobles and king's officers mentioned by Herodotus may well have been with this campaign in view. This was the king of Persia who was ruling at the time. Not a very nice man. The next slide. The importance. The king who ruled the 127 states from India to Kush. In those days, King Xerxes ruled from his capital city of Susa. Now, understand, he was an important ruler and powerful. He had an abundance of riches, an abundance of resources. He was very prosperous and wealthy as a king. If we look at the next map, we see the area that was his. It's no mean feat. It was a huge empire. We're told it was massive. It included India, northern Sudan, Pakistan, east of the Afghan mountains, which were part of the Persian Empire under Darius I. It covered Kush, which was part of Egypt, and parts of Ethiopia. Under his father, Darius I, he delivered the empire divided it up into 20 territories under different governors, who subdivided these territories into provinces, which at the time of this text numbered 127 provinces, meaning there were 6 provinces in each state or territory. It just shows you the size of his kingdom. Now, I want you to think about that. How many people would it take to administer all the services that were required? It's huge. We talk about large public service, but can you imagine how big the public service was required to administer throughout the Persian Empire? Huge. The primary residence of the king was located in Susa. He was an absolute ruler of this vast kingdom, and what he said goes, What he does influenced and affected all the people who were citizens of his kingdom, whether they liked it or not. He didn't hold a consensus and ask them if they were okay with it. He just told them this is what it's going to be. A person with absolute wealth, absolute power, and a tyrant to boot. His only desire was to have whatever he wanted because no one was able to stand in his way. If they did, he removed them and they vanished from the scene. In Susa is where he planned his operation against the Greek. It was a huge enterprise, and we can therefore understand why after his initial planning, which itself took years, he would gather these nobles and the principal officers who would have the responsibility for planning and organising the whole affair. To get his way, he had to entertain them in a big way. And so this is what he did. The next one, next slide. A cultivated arrogance. One of the things about the Persian culture that we must understand, it was all about appearances. All about appearances. And Xerxes set the tone for the progress in all areas of Persian culture. People who wanted to be with the in crowd had to adopt the latest fads and ideologies if they planned to get ahead. Can you see where it's crossing over to our day and age now? We don't engage in debate. It's my way or the highway. And if you want to be part of this crowd, you better adopt the narrative and get with it. This is how it was even in the Persian culture. Appearances were everything. While he exercised great power over his kingdom and his subjects, there was one person he couldn't control. Can you guess who it was? Himself. He could not control himself. Whatever he wanted, he took. And there was no one to stop him. So while he had this power over everyone, he had no power over himself. He was so full of himself and his achievements, he was impulsive and didn't think things through. He was easily flattered and swayed by compliments, but just as easily, he was given to temper tantrums when he didn't like the way things were going. And he had no problems letting you know, I am not happy with you. So this is the type of leader that you had in charge. Politically, we see his character was flawed. He was seen as a weak individual who could be easily swayed from one opinion to another. And so a lot of his advice often came from his eunuchs and counsellors to give him advice. So he'd ask this person, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And he had a variety of opinions. It was all too hard. Politically, he was considered inept and slightly insane with his attack on Greece, which was nothing more than a personal desire to bring Greece to heel after being humiliated by them. This is what his father had experienced. And the arrogance of the Persian kings knew no bounds in displaying their wealth by wearing precious jewels in their beards. You might have seen some pictures in history of the jewels in their beard. I don't know why. I can imagine Phil with a beard full of jewels going around. But in Persian culture, jewels were a sign of rank and importance among the men. So the more jewels you had, hey, I'm important, look at me. I'm somebody. The Persian soldiers wore large amounts of jewels and gold when they went to battle. I can only imagine how many of them died and the soldiers that killed them were looting as they went, getting all the jewels and the gold that they could. Xerxes had a special group of warriors called the Immortals, who were his personal bodyguards. They were always decked in gold raiment. Their numbers were never allowed to go below 10,000 men. So he had 10,000 bodyguards around him at all times. So the Persian culture shows us what happens when money and pleasure is the main objective of society. It hasn't changed in our modern times today. It's all about me, what I want, and you better not stop me from getting what I want. It's the same mentality, it's the same culture. History repeating itself again and again. The next slide. The impression. In the 3rd year of his rule, he gave a banquet for all his important men and royal officers. The army leaders from the countries of Persia and Media, and the important men from all Xerxes' empire were there. So he's got a plan, he's got an agenda. So he decides to throw a banquet for all the elites of society. Get them on board was his idea. All the movers and shakers, all those who were progressive, he got them to a banquet. They were given an invitation. If you receive this invitation, you dare not say, I'm sorry, I'm busy, I'm doing something else. It would be noted. So you attended. As I've said, Persian culture was all about appearances. It was about a persona that was designed to impress people by showing off wealth and power. And Xerxes was somebody that you take notice of. Somebody you paid attention to. Somebody you wanted to be seen. The next slide. The banquet lasted 180 days. All during that time, King Xerxes was showing off the great wealth of his kingdom, his great riches and glory. Now, if you're in a position like Xerxes, you believed you could do whatever you wanted. And you would assume that everybody would get on board to your proposal. So he had this agenda. He held a feast or a banquet that would last 180 days in duration. Now, 180 days, that's a huge party. But it was designed to show off the wealth of the Persian kingdom, what he'd achieved through his family dynasty. He wanted recognition, he wanted accolades, he wanted it all. But he was more interested in promoting himself, his opinions and his wealth, and what it could buy. In other words, he wanted to make himself a name among the leaders of the world. He wanted to be known as the King of Kings, rather than helping the citizens of his kingdom. Now, I could be talking about our modern day society today. It could fit very easily. Our leaders are about promoting themselves. They're about promoting their ideologies that they believe will change. The change that they bring will benefit everybody, while the reality is they never deliver in helping those who need it the most. Our leaders have an agenda that they're pursuing, promoting and prosecuting anyone who resists that agenda, without thinking through the impact of what is being proposed or even considering alternatives that would provide them with better incomes. Xerxes, though, had ulterior motives for this feast, as we can see by those invited. He wanted to invade Greece. He wanted to expand his kingdom, and Greece would be his ultimate trophy. Now that didn't concern him in the slightest, that most of his population was against invading Greece. His father had tried it previously and had proven a failure. And the people didn't want to see history repeating itself. So the feast was designed, that's why it lasted 180 days. He wanted the support of the most prominent people in society. He wanted them to give their approval and to convince them that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he had the finances and resources to fund this campaign against Greece. So a 180-day feast is a long time. But it would take that time to think about the strategy that was going to be used to get into Greece. What tactics to be used. And I'm sure that the king would have got rid of anybody who didn't put positive contributions to his plan. The next slide. The consuming appetite. As I've said, appearance and virtue signaling are the tools of the cancer culture revolution. The desire to bring about change, to gain recognition and promote an agenda of their own making. And that's what we're seeing in our society today. In our text, King Xerxes wasn't concerned about the cost involved in getting business done if he got what he wanted. As far as he was concerned, that's all that mattered. And its agenda that was never satisfied. It seeks to deceive and destroy all opposition that is opposed to anything going in that same direction. We see this in our society today with renewable energy targets, climate control devices, and those that seek to debate it or offer alternatives are crushed and humiliated on the social media platforms such as Twitter as being against ideological changes that they believe are necessary to save us from ourselves, to save the planet. And so people who are against it are forced to succumb and give into it, or they cease to exist. That's what's happening in our society. Hey, this is nothing new. This has been around for a while. And those who promote these agendas are determined and believe they are doing what is right. They're doing what is right because they want to do something before it's too late. And we see their numbers growing every day. We see people flocking to embrace this new religion of green energy while those who stand against them are in decline. It's an agenda that has a never-ending appetite. It's never totally satisfied, and it must be constantly fed to increase its momentum and deception. So it's a consuming appetite. It knows no end. The next slide. The insolence. When the 180 days were over, the king gave another banquet. It was held in the courtyard of the palace garden for 7 days. It was for everybody in the palace at Susa, from the greatest to the least. Now, I'm amazed. 180 days for the elite to come together to have a party, and that's not enough. We whack on a big banquet for everybody. Hey, people, it's party time. The invitations are given. Everybody is to come. All levels of society are involved, and the tentacles of the propaganda machine are in full swing. To garner people's favour is being courted by offering every seducing thing that they can think of, by giving them the trappings of power and wealth and pleasure. It's all laid on. It's all for free. As one commentator states, everyone would be in some state of inebriation, which sounds outrageous. I mean, who would have the money to do such a thing? But we have recorded in history by a court physician in the times of Artaxerxes, who was the son of King Xerxes, regularly provided feasts with no less than 15,000 people sitting at his table over a 10-day celebration. There were 69,574 guests in attendance. So what it says, money was no object. None at all. These guests were given the best by way of accommodation. These events were hosted in the palace to put the palace on the best display with all the wealth, so that people were impressed by what they saw. It appealed to their eyes and their appetites. This is something that you could have. And we know from Scripture this is a well-worn strategy that works well. It's still used today by our enemy. He seeks to entrap mankind into the pleasures of the flesh and desire for possessions because of the things people see. It's designed to present and capture the imaginations of people, to transport them from reality to think about only the present possibilities available to them if they got on board with the proposal. The next slide. The immorality. The courtyard had fine white curtains, purple drapes that were tied to silver rings on marble pillars, by white and purple cords, and there were gold and silver couches on a floor set with tiles of white marble, shells and gems. This was a 7-day feast. It was a culmination of months of preparation on the king's part. He appealed to the elite of society to get them on board. This wasn't just a once-off sampling. This was a fantasy, if you like, escape. He was offering them something that they hadn't experienced before, a week-long sensual finale. And we know Xerxes couldn't control his appetites. He took what he wanted without restraints. He understood human nature very well. He knew what people wanted and desired, and he used that strategy to the best advantage because he believed that the more that he could get people to indulge themselves in the pleasures offered, the more likely they were to come on board and give him what he wanted. It works today in the same way. People are suckered into things they never intended to get involved in. They get involved in things that they become addicted to, things that they saw, things that they wanted, pleasures that they experienced, but the enemy made sure that they were distracted so they didn't see the real objective. And it doesn't take long before these things take control of your senses, take over your life. Sin will grab you and pull you in, take you further than you've ever intended to go, keeping you longer than you intended to stay, and cost you more than you intended to pay. Our text is a scene of promoting sensual pleasure. It impacted the eyes. It drew you strategically to well laid out beds of gold, set out on various colours of marble. It was designed to encourage you to indulge your sexual fantasies. It promoted sexual pleasures. It was saying to you, forget who you are right now, where you are, just go with the flow and enjoy what is offered. It's called hedonism today, but it's being that appetite and soaked up in the moment of what is being offered. The next slide. The indulgence, wine was served in gold cups of various kinds, and there were plenty of king's wine because he was very generous. So our text is telling you there's every type of indulgence was promoted and approved, and it was available. You didn't drink from plastic cups, people. You drank from gold cups. Only the best was offered. So can you imagine getting a gold cup in your hand? You would think you were somebody. And they drank a never-ending supply of the king's wine. But hey, that's a strategy that was employed. Get people drunk, appeal to their senses, let them indulge themselves to access, gain the favour of those in power in society. We see the same thing happening in our society today. Indulgence in immorality, alcohol and drugs, they're everywhere, and it's encouraged and promoted on a large scale as being something that's accessible. Everybody does it. And yet, we have the contradictory messages that tells people, but drink responsible. Be responsible in your drinking. But they never encourage you to leave it alone. Even though the consequences of indulgence are readily seen in society, people are not prepared to give them up. Now, I've wondered about the financial cost of Xerxes, where the money came from, and I mean, how deep were his pockets? Well, I also found in history recorded for us, Herodotus, the historian of the time, says this: Persia's wealth and magnificence even dazzled Alexander the Great. When more than a century later he entered the palace of Susa, he found 40,000 talents of gold and silver bullion, about 12,000 tons of the stuff, plus 9,000 talents of minted coins, about 270 tons worth of it, which had been accumulated by the Persian kings. So they were rich. Very rich. Verse 8, in the next slide. The king commanded that the guests be permitted to drink as much as they wished. He told the wine servers to serve each man what he wanted. Now, if you drink enough alcohol, it brings about indiscretions. And Xerxes was well aware of what he was doing when he made sure the alcohol flowed in abundance. He appointed various stewards to make sure that when they saw an empty cup, make sure it was full again, so that people could indulge in their pleasures without restraints or limitations. Anything goes was the motto of the day. Whatever you want, it's free. Whatever you want to do, it's acceptable. Go for it. Our text says the king encouraged every man to fulfill his desires. Nothing was off limits. You know, it's as though we have learnt nothing from the past, because isn't that where we are today? No restraints, go with the flow, do whatever you want. We're told not to question what people do, just accept it. It's their own business. It's no concern of yours. We're encouraged to embrace any and every type of behaviour in case we offend someone who may act against us, in case we offend them. Same sort of thing. And lastly, verse 9, the next slide, the indifference. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of the king Xerxes. So here we've got Xerxes having a party for all the men, and it went on and on. But the women were not left out either, because Vashti had her own party. In Persian culture, men and women did not associate and do things in the public arena. So she had her own space, her own servants. She entertained the elite ladies of the kingdom with their own banquets to eat, drink, and be merry. Now, I've called this indifference because it shows just what Xerxes thought of his wife. The way he treated her by allowing and promoting disgraceful behaviour that was happening right there in his own house. He was responsible. He did nothing to promote a godly example for his wife or for any of the other women. All he did was promote indulgence as a way of life for the women as well as the men. Yet studies have shown that when it comes to practicing restraint, guess who's the better qualified to do it? Men or women? Women are more likely to practice restraint than men. That's what the studies have shown. But you know, that's rapidly changing in our day and age, when the emphasis is placed on having a good time, looking after number one, promoting yourself and doing whatever you want because, hey, you're entitled to it, you deserve it, you need to look after yourself. And so what it shows is a failure of leadership with men failing to set the right example, with several women who are promoting immorality and sinful practices in our day and culture today. We see that happening in our news. In verse 9, I could be speaking modern day culture here in Australia. I could be speaking about what's happening here in Darwin, in our community. It's a little closer to home than what we think. We are becoming aware of the rapid changes in value settings that are happening, and we wonder where we're heading as a society. What hope is there for those who want to remain faithful and true to the Lord in such a dominating society? How do we survive this virtue signalling age of cancel culturalists and their agenda? How do we remain faithful and true to God despite the pressures to conform or be counseled? God still has his people who he raises up for times like this, and this is what the book of Esther is all about, to encourage us not to give up but to persevere, because our God is able. So I hope that that's been a good introduction Should I go further? Or are you bored? We will continue with the book next week, but I hope that it becomes